And as I wrote in the preface to Caliban and the Witch, in fact, I began after beginning to, I was very interested in looking at the history of the women's oppression, what used to be called women's oppression, and seeing how it had changed in capitalism in response to many of the debates that were taking place in the women's movement as to whether the gender-based discrimination was a legacy of tradition, was a remnant of previous patriarchal relation, or it was a specific type of social reality specific to capitalism. So that's how I began this historical work that started with the 19th century and then, for lack of good answers, took me back to the Middle Ages. And then after a while, I began to collaborate with Leopoldo Fortunati as I wrote in the preface to Caliban and the Witch. We had an early version of this work, but actually quite different. In Italian, they came out in 1984, but where I began to sketch the discussion of the witch hunt and the discussion of the transformation of the body in capitalism. But we also discussed other issues, such as, for example, the transformation that child raising undergoes in the beginning of capitalist development. So this is a work that has accompanied me for decades. And by 2004, I had been with it almost 30 years.
There's a book that you published in '84 in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
What like how did you do the research? Was it with Fortunati and others?
Yeah, we actually worked quite separately because I was in New York and she was in Padova, so we actually did work in a separate way. Even though we kind of exchanged some basic informations, but so that work was supposed to basically concentrated on looking at different aspects of the reorganization of reproduction. For example, it has a chapter on the transformation of sociality, of forms of sociality. It has a chapter on precisely the redefinition of the figure of the child. It has a chapter specifically on the question of sexuality. But the framework of that book was somewhat different. In a way, it was before the beginning of globalization. And the idea there was, in a way, to show that the classic operaist, one of the ideas, but that not only the classic Marxist approach to primitive accumulation, but also the operaist approach to class struggle and to basically capitalist development were unsatisfactory. And one of the themes in the introduction was first comes society, in quote, meaning first comes the reproduction of labor power and then comes the factory, which turned the other way around. For example, the Trontian idea that the factory is the prime mover, and in a sense the factory then also changes society. And our argument was that when you look actually at the history of capitalism, you see that capitalism first had to form a certain type of laborer, and only in a later period, in a sense, creates, on the basis of the formation of that type of labor, also creates a certain type of organization of work. Mm-hmm. Particularly a large-scale industrial organization of industrial work.
Yeah. Before we come to the Caliban and the Witch book, after publishing the Italian version, and before this is 20 years, right? Before you published the book Caliban and the Witch, how did that discussion continue? Did you collaborate with others apart from?
No. Actually, that discussion pretty much continued. I continued the work pretty much by myself. But one major development that took place was the fact that by the early 80s, I went to Africa. I was in Africa for about 3 years, and that experience was fundamental because in Africa I saw really the beginning of globalization. I saw what were the first element of a return of primitive accumulation, through the imposition of structural adjustment and all the policies that were enacted in response to the debt crisis. So in a way, again, as I wrote in the introduction to Caliban and the Witch, I was continuously brought back to the period of primitive accumulation, but what was unfolding, under my eyes, including the fact that the discussion about the debt crisis, the conditionalities posed by the IMF, and the discussion of austerity came hand in hand with a whole ideological attack on women, which in many ways were accused of having caused the crisis with their excessive demand and with their pressure on the workers, the family member, etc., for better living conditions. So the striking similarity between the processes that I saw unfolding in the 80s in Nigeria and what I had been reading concerning the period of primitive accumulation was very important for my own rethinking and my own placing that discussion also in a broader framework.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the book, like how, the book is divided in several chapters. Could you describe like the contents and the main argument?
Yeah, basically the book is made of a number of chapters. The first one, it's a chapter about the crisis of feudalism, and in particular is a chapter that looks at the reasons why capitalism developed, and which was fundamental in my view in order to understand what would be the modalities of the new structures and the new structures that capitalism had to implement. So I, in particular, was concerned with demystifying, rejecting the assumption that capitalism was a kind of evolution out of economic structures that had developed in the Middle Ages, and to show, in fact, that capitalism was a counter-revolution. The capitalism was the response to a whole set of social movements, a struggle. That was very important to me because it connected, it really gave me an insight, into the struggle that women had been making in the course of the struggle against feudal power. And therefore an insight as to why the attack, why capitalism, in a way, the development of capitalism had to start with this massive attack on women. This was for me one of the most exciting and satisfying researches, because it brought me in contact with the whole set of social movement that I knew vaguely of, like the heretic movement, from my early studies of European history, but I had no idea how important those movements had been, because the heretic movement were really movement of social struggle. They were movement against basically feudal power, but also the beginning of commercialization and of social relations. And I began to see also the role of women within this heretic movement, which was very strong. Women had a central presence in those movements. So this was important because, first of all, allowed me to see two things in terms of understanding capitalism. It allowed me to see, number one, that capitalism had come in response to a struggle, and in particular in response to the labor crisis, to the command of a labor, the crisis of command of a labor that this movement had produced. And therefore, not accidentally, capitalism was vitally interested in creating relations that would maximize the exploitation of labor. And second, that within this struggle, and women have played an important role, and the refusal of certain relation with men, and also a particular relation to procreation, and have been important, have played an important role in the struggle. For example, the heretic movement gave women a certain status of parity with men, and also a movement that was critical with respect to women's subordination, but also the exclusion of women from the position of some power, for example, in the organization and administration of sacraments and so forth. So that too was important because it opened the possibility of understanding why this specific attack on women.